The young man nervously grips the hilt of his rusty sword. Despite the fresh air of an early morning, he is drenched with sweat.
He shuffles about, bumping into the people all around him. The crowd that has gathered in the chapel is huge, full of anonymous faces. Serfs, laborers, tradesmen, students, apprentices, even royal courtiers.
There's an air of expectancy. The man can taste it on his tongue. Prague is getting ready.
The man is no legendary hero.
He has a name, but it isn't important. He has a profession, but no one will remember what it was. He is a nobody.
But what he and his comrades do today will change the course of history.
He runs his hand over the sword again. It feels strange to hold its weight within the sacred walls of a church. Normally forbidden, of course. But the priest had been very clear during the secret meeting after last week's mass. The weapons will be needed for what's coming.
Look, there's the priest now, climbing the steps to the unfinished pulpit. Master Jan Zelivsky, a fierce follower to the great martyr Jan Hus.
He begins to speak, his voice steady at first, but soon growing louder, rising to a shout, and then a full-throated yell.
The man with the sword doesn't really listen, though. His ears are humming, his mouth is dry. He knows exactly what the message is.
Rise up, brothers and sisters. The time is now. Take up your arms. March on the town hall. And if anyone dares to stand against us, kill them.
The man glances around, catching the glint of steel from swords and spears, and the fierce determination in the eyes of his fellow conspirators.
But first, they must perform a sacred ritual, consuming the body of Christ and drinking his blood. Only this act will grant them the strength and absolution they need for what they're about to do.
Once the communion is completed, the people spill out into the street. Leading them is the priest Zelivsky, holding a holy monstrance with the sacramental bread inside, as if it were a war banner.
He marches at the front of his ragtag army, guiding them towards the seat of power. As the mob surrounds the city hall, an eerie, frightening silence falls over them. The man with the sword stands at the forefront, eyes fixed on the great locked doors.
Inside, fellow dissidents are imprisoned, arrested during a previous protest. Master Jan's voice cuts through the stillness.
Let our people go.
He commands the king's counselors inside.
Release them, and no one needs to get hurt.
For several tense moments, nothing happens. Then, all at once, chaos erupts. The crowd, howling with rage, surges forward, battering the gate until it gives way.
The man with the sword is among them, certain that something has triggered the violence. Did someone throw a stone from the city hall window? Did Zelivsky give the order to attack?
It doesn't matter now. The gate is down, and there's no turning back, only forward, up the stairs and into the second-story room where the councillors have gathered.
They are unarmed and terrified. There's nowhere to run. One of them, the Lord Mayor Jan Hus, an older, seasoned gentleman, puts up his hands in a gesture of surrender.
The man strikes him in the mouth with the hilt of his sword. The Lord Mayor falls to the ground, stunned. Someone gestures towards a window. The man with the sword nods.
They grab the bleeding mayor by the ankles and drag him across the room. Then they hoist him up and, without hesitation, toss him out the window. With a sickening crunch, he hits the street below.
The poor councillor clearly isn't dead. He's groaning and writhing in pain. but not for long. The mass of people outside spills over his body like a wave.
They beat him ferociously, without mercy. When the crowd finally disperses, the dead Lord Mayor's body lies motionless on the ground. No way back.
The man with the sword mutters and inhales a shaky breath.
No way back. No way back. He turns towards the room and helps his friends with another counselor. Then another. Then another. Soon, 11 corpses are piled up beneath the windows, and every rebel prisoner still alive is liberated.
The crowd falls silent again. The man with the sword watches the priest Zelivsky as he speaks again, forbidding any looting or theft. Even the richly dressed counselors' bodies are to be left alone, untouched.
This is not murder, after all. This is justice.
The rebels act swiftly, immediately electing their own counselors to replace those just murdered. When mounted guardsmen arrive at the scene, their commander takes one look at the armed mob and promptly orders a retreat.
The daring uprising has worked, but it isn't over yet. The future of the rebellion remains uncertain, hinging on one person, King Wenceslaus of Bohemia. And so, the city holds its breath. My name is Vasha.
And I am Elżbieta, and this is Bloody Heart of Europe. You may have heard the word defenestration before. It's a term referring to throwing someone or something out of a window. It may seem bizarrely specific. We don't really have a unique word for climbing in through a window, so why should the other direction be any different? Well, the main difference is that defenestration has made history. Strangely enough, two of the most famous ones happened in Prague, and each of them directly triggered a devastating war.
In 1618, some 200 years after our story, a Protestant mob will chuck Catholic politicians out of the window and start the 30 Years' War. But let's turn our focus to a morning 2 centuries earlier, to the scene which opened our episode, to the first defenestration of Prague.
The seemingly spontaneous, but probably well-planned murder of the king's councillors in the streets of the capital will shatter the status quo in Bohemia. Who was responsible? How and why did it happen? And to whose benefit? And why would the death of a few men precipitate a large-scale war across not only Bohemia, but all the neighboring countries as well?
For the answers, we need to rewind time 4 years back to the immediate aftermath of the death of Jan Hus in the German city of Constance. You may recall from our previous episode that Hus, the radical reformer and critic of the Catholic Church, was burnt at the stake for his beliefs.
This was done with the silent consent of Sigismund, the ambitious king of Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire, who had already alienated the population of Bohemia by invading at the head of a foreign army. And by killing Jan Hus, he turned a flickering flame into an unstoppable blaze. The movement, now known as the Hussites after their beloved preacher, wasn't going to disappear.
The uproar would come, but not right away. The supporters of Hus across the country were devastated by his execution, but also unsure about what to do next. Perhaps surprisingly, it wasn't the poor masses in Prague or Hus's rustic acolytes in the countryside who reacted first.
It was the nobility. A significant portion of Bohemian nobles liked Hus and his ideas. They too saw that the church was in many ways greedy and corrupt, and the killing of Hus dismayed them. So they gathered together in a meeting to decide on their best course of action.
There were hundreds of important men at the meeting, but one of them stood out from all the rest. Czeniec of Württemberg, the supreme burgrave of the Kingdom of Bohemia, and therefore the second man of the realm after the king. Czeniec had been a committed supporter of Jan Hus even before the events in Constance. During Hus's exile from Prague, Czeniec even offered him a place to stay at one of his castles.
Hus was now dead, but Czeniec wasn't going to simply accept it and move on. Instead, he initiated a response. Together with his friends and allies, he did something extraordinary, even if it may not sound like it at first. He penned a strongly worded letter of protest addressed to the council in Constance. 452 Bohemian nobles ratified it with their seal. Czeniec's seal was the first among them all.
To them, Jan Hus wasn't just an innocent man. He was someone who had pretty valid points about the church's corruption. The Council of Constance had no business executing him, just like they had no right to tell the people of Bohemia what to believe. As for punishing Hus's followers, well, the Bohemian nobles weren't having it, at least not until there was a new pope. In the meantime, any religious disputes would be sorted out by the learned men at Charles University in Prague. After all, the people of Bohemia could handle their own issues. They didn't need a bunch of out-of-touch foreigners who had never even been to their country telling them what to do.
This was a shocking thing to do, a revolutionary act in the context of Europe in the 1400s. The power of the Catholic Church was supposed to transcend any national and political boundaries. It was meant to be absolute, inviolable, and unifying. Czeniec of Württemberg, together with his allies, rejected this and basically said, "This is our country, and we will decide what to do here."
With this, Czeniec made new enemies both abroad and at home. It's important to note that the Kingdom of Bohemia was never unified in its support for Hus and his ideas. There were still many people, great nobles among them, fiercely loyal to the Catholic Church. They didn't like to see such insolence towards the papacy. In answer, the Catholic nobles formed their own league, aiming to oppose the Hussites. And so, the kingdom stood at the precipice.
This heightened tension in the kingdom was dangerous, and everyone was getting nervous, apart from one man. Wenceslaus, the King of Bohemia. By now, he was 54 years old, long faded from European relevance, living in the shadow of his successful younger brother Sigismund.
But this new stalemate presented an excellent opportunity for him personally. For years, his authority had been weak, curtailed by the nobility. Indeed, in the past, the League of Lords rebelled against their king, captured him, and forced him into humiliating concessions. Now, the nobles were arguing amongst themselves and were in no position to bother him. Wenceslaus had one goal: to keep them busy. If nothing changed and no one won, the king would be more than happy with that. And if he could play one side against the other, even better.
Another reason for Wenceslaus not to do anything against the Hussites was that he actually liked them, at least the moderate wing of the movement. The king had long despised any form of religious fanaticism, so he wasn't too keen on the radicals. What's more, many of the king's close associates were Hussite supporters, chief among them his wife, Queen Sophia of Bavaria. She was so smitten by the new ideas that she had personally been to the Bethlehem chapel to see Jan Hus preaching.
Although Wenceslaus and his court did nothing to improve the brittle situation in the kingdom, it didn't immediately result in an all-out war. Instead, what came next was a series of escalating feuds. First, the Hussites took over a number of monasteries in the countryside. 2 of them even drowned an abbot. This wasn't holy vengeance for Jan Hus either. The men simply held a previous grudge against the monks and decided to use the situation for their own benefit. This is telling. All across the country, many of the violent acts were shabbily justified by religion, while in reality happening for personal reasons.
Whatever the cause for violence, the Catholics responded in kind. A notable incident happened in Kuttenberg, the richest city in the kingdom, famed for its silver mines. A party arrived in the city to collect taxes for the king, led by Sir Radzik Kobyla. Sir Radzik was a supporter of the Hussite movement, and he came as a representative of the king who did nothing to protect his Catholic subjects.
This was enough of a reason for the Catholic priests in the city to incite an angry mob against him. A large group of miners from the nearby silver mines gathered near an inn where Radzik and his retinue were staying. They forced their way inside the building and brutally massacred Radzik and his 12 followers. They cut their bodies into pieces and, in what seems to have become a theme for this episode, threw the body parts out of the window.
Now, even the shocking murder of his tax collector could convince the king to act. Wenceslaus was more than willing to ignore even the most brutal crimes if it meant preserving the status quo. Yes, he was angry for a while, but after the Kuttenberg consulars sent him a few bags of silver along with a message that they had executed 2 of the miners, Wenceslaus let it slide. The king's unwillingness to side with anybody would characterize the coming months.
The Catholic response wasn't limited to the grassroots. The church itself tried to intervene. Its leadership issued interdicts over Hussite-dominated cities and banned all church services there, even weddings and funerals. But it was a toothless solution. The Hussites had no reason to respect orders from Rome. Czerniak of Wartenberg was pretty clear in his letters to Constance. All matters of faith in Bohemia were to be handled by Bohemians themselves. So, the Hussites simply expelled the Catholic priests from their churches and replaced them with their own clergy.
You would expect that the wider European community would support the Bohemian Catholics. After all, these Hussites were clearly heretics, taking shots at the Pope and his closest associates. But surprisingly, no help was forthcoming, at least not right away. The Catholic leadership was too busy dealing with more pressing problems. They still had to resolve the papal schism, for example.
And Sigismund, the great protector of Catholicism, the enemy of heretics everywhere, surely he would do something to stop Czerniak and his rebels. Well, not really, since he was currently traveling Europe chasing a runaway pope. The only thing he found the time to do was to send a very angry letter. It turned out to be less devastating than he had probably hoped. "Stop, or I will come for you at the head of a holy crusade," was the gist of it. Czerniak and his friends didn't stop.
On the contrary, more than ever, they were determined to succeed. And the first step was to unite their views. Same as every movement throughout history that went against the established rules, the Hussites held many conflicting opinions. There were so many questions to answer. Do we like paintings in churches? Do we worship the saints? Do we pray for the dead? What about capital punishment? But nothing divided the early Hussites as much as the question of the communion under both kinds.
If you're not sure what it means, that's all right. Let's get an explanation from Jacob of Mies, a Hussite priest and one of the fiercest defenders of the practice. Jacob had actually been a classmate of Jan Hus at the university, and they soon became good friends. Like Hus, Jacob hated the excessive wealth and corruption within the church, but he also didn't like the way the Catholics served their holy mass. During the ceremony, ordinary churchgoers received only the bread, the body of Christ. The wine, his blood, was reserved for the priests.
Jacob thought this was unacceptable. Just another way for arrogant priests to elevate themselves above their flock. At earlier points in the history of Christianity, the common believers received both the bread and the wine. And if the original followers of Jesus did it this way, it was surely good enough for Jacob's contemporaries.
Jacob wasn't just inspired by the good old days, by the way. He also thought that the world would soon end, that the signs were undeniable. The Antichrist was at the doorstep, and all good Christians would have to stand against the evil he would bring. To fight such an enemy, the believers needed all the strength they could get, and only by eating God's body and drinking his blood would they gain enough power for the final battle.
The communion under both kinds was controversial among the Hussites. Even Hus himself had hesitated to endorse it, and for good reason. What Jacob proposed was a massive change to the Catholic holy rite. Many thought that there was no way the Pope and the rest of the Christian world could ever accept it. And if they didn't, then what? The majority of Hussites never wanted to create their own splinter church. They wanted to make the Catholic one better. So why would they preemptively sink any attempt at diplomacy for a sip of wine?
While the Hussites squabbled about the communion, one man looked at the ideological chaos with deep disapproval. Czeniec of Württemberg was a seasoned politician, and he knew what the movement needed was absolute unity. They had more than enough enemies, both at home and abroad.
So the Supreme Burgrave came up with an unexpected idea. If we, the Hussites, can't decide amongst ourselves and aren't going to listen to the Pope, why not turn to the University of Prague again? The professors were already the ones settling various religious disputes. Czeniec now asked them to write the rules which would unify all of the Hussites under a common set of ideas.
They agreed, and in the debates that followed, Jacob's side won. The communion under both kinds was declared to be an integral part of the Hussite cause, and so it would remain. In the following decades, the distinctive banner with the holy chalice would fly over many bloody battlefields.
The situation in Bohemia has now become completely unprecedented. Never before was the Church as a central authority of the faith usurped by a university, an institution with no direct connection to the usual structures of Catholic establishment. And instead of being subservient to the Pope, the university mostly worked with and for the Bohemian nobility. Czeniec and the rest of the Hussite nobles suddenly became extraordinarily powerful. They could easily influence not only secular matters, but also spiritual ones, such as who could serve as a priest and who could not.
Czeniec soon demonstrated his newfound power. He decided that more Hussite priests were needed, and that to make them seem more legitimate, especially in the eyes of the conservatives, they should be consecrated by a prominent Catholic priest. So he kidnapped a Catholic bishop named Herman and imprisoned him at one of his castles.
Unsurprisingly, Bishop Herman didn't take kindly to the demands of his abductor, but Czeniec was unfazed. Perhaps drawing inspiration from his overlord, King Wenceslaus, he had Herman tortured until he submitted. In doing so, Czeniec ensured a steady flow of reformist priests, who were technically speaking sanctioned by the Church itself.
It seemed like the Hussites were winning. Their position in Bohemia was getting stronger by the day. They even started to dream of convincing the Catholic hierarchy to accept their new ideas as a solution to the Church's ongoing crisis. Then, the word of Hus would dominate all of Christendom. But soon, the Hussites would be woken up from their daydream by a new enemy.
It wasn't the Antichrist they all feared, but a man, Martin V, the newly elected Pope. After years of deliberation, the Church finally got a new, strong leader, and he wasn't one for compromises. He got the top job on the promise of bringing back order and stamping out division among the Christians. The stamping would be done by an iron boot, and the Hussites would be the first to feel its weight.
The Pope immediately proclaimed a series of edicts banning the movement. All Hussites would from this point on be considered heretics. The Pope wouldn't go after them personally, since he had enough problems elsewhere, but he chose a dependable middleman. The matter of the Bohemian rebels would be dealt with by King Sigismund of the Holy Roman Empire.
Sigismund, of course, had his own interests in the country. His brother Wenceslaus was growing older and weaker every day. And with no son to inherit the throne, Sigismund would soon add Bohemia to his growing collection of royal titles. His dream of united Europe, standing firm against the threat of Islam from the south, was creeping ever closer. But first, he needed to deal with these rebellious fanatics stirring up trouble in his future kingdom.
There was a smarter way to go about this than a full-scale invasion, though. After all, why would Sigismund burn down the lands that he would soon own? Instead, the Holy Roman King arranged a meeting with leading Bohemian nobles, including the Supreme Burgrave Czernik, the leader of the Hussite nobility.
Whatever everyone might have thought about Sigismund's reputation as a ruthless conqueror, it's undeniable that he was a skilled diplomat. His message to the assembled nobles was clear and seductive. He was going to become their next king, he reminded them. And when that happened, the Hussite nobles had nothing to fear from him. He wouldn't punish them for straying from the Catholic path. They were wise men, one and all, and Sigismund respected them immensely. The Hussite priests would be a different matter, of course. Sigismund would squash the radical heretics like the bugs they were.
What Sigismund had done was very clever and achieved two things at once. First, the king showed the Hussite nobles his more benevolent side and offered them future peaceful coexistence. They would now hesitate before declaring themselves Sigismund's enemies. Second, he created an immediate rift between the lords and the Hussite clergymen, who had, up to this point, worked together for mutual benefit. Would the lords really risk a fight when offered an easy way out? Would the priests trust them to? A classic divide-and-conquer scenario.
It was clear Sigismund's words struck a chord with many people. And soon the Hussites really began to splinter, exactly like Sigismund thought they would. But the name of the chief defector may surprise you: Czernik of Württemberg, the leader of the moderate Hussite nobles and a fierce opponent of the Pope, suddenly distanced himself from the conflict. We don't exactly know what went through his head. Was he afraid of Sigismund? Did he take the last way out before the war inevitably broke out? Whatever it was, his withdrawal left the moderate Hussites without their key leader and supporter.
Unlike his supreme Burgrave, King Wenceslaus chose to resist his brother's policies. He hated Sigismund's encroachment into his kingdom and refused to stop supporting the Hussites. On the contrary, he became quite open in his sympathies towards them, such as when he appointed new city councillors, clearly leaning towards accepting the Hussite reforms.
While Sigismund may have taken a soft stance with the Hussite nobles, he had no patience for his foolish brother.
Instead of subtle diplomacy, he sent him a threat. If the King of Bohemia did nothing against the Hussites, perhaps the best course of action would be to remove him from office. Wenceslaus couldn't take this lightly. Sigismund already imprisoned him once, and maybe he could do it again.
To make matters worse, the conservative elements turned their attention to Wenceslaus's wife, Queen Sophia of Bavaria. She was an obvious target since she had been a key supporter of the Hussites at the royal court. So one day, an envoy arrived from Rome, with what seemed less like an invitation and more like a summons. The message ordered the queen to travel to Italy and stand before the papal court. It was pretty obvious they weren't inviting her over for a friendly chat over a glass of wine.
The queen wisely chose not to accept and stayed in Prague. All the same, Wenceslaus was rattled. With his brother pressing him on one side, the Pope on the other, and his own nobles divided and squabbling, the king realized that openly supporting the Hussites had become too risky. But he wasn't ready to turn his back on them completely. So he set out to find a middle ground.
He convened a meeting, inviting the members of his royal council, representatives from the city of Prague, and a select group of important priests. There, Wenceslaus proposed a compromise. He wouldn't outright ban the Hussites, but to appease the church and Sigismund, they would have to lie low for a while. Their ceremonies would be restricted to private chapels, plus 3 specifically designated churches in the capital.
It was an ambitious plan, and one Wenceslaus genuinely believed in. Yes, the king's support of the Hussites may have been in part driven by pragmatism, because the divide among the nobility suited him politically. But he also really thought that the Hussites and the Catholics could peacefully coexist. They might enrich each other, and who knows, in time, they might even become united.
Wenceslaus misjudged the situation completely, however. Honestly, it was to be expected. Delicate diplomacy was never his strong suit, and he couldn't really grasp the depths of the religious radicalism that now gripped his country. Wenceslaus always hated godly fanatics and didn't understand them. But while all the rich men were sending envoys and had their meetings behind closed doors, the most radical Hussites, the poor from the cities and the countryside, had plans of their own. And for them, the era of seeking compromises had finally reached its end.
In 1419, the bloody priest wanted to acquire power and domination over all. In 2025, we just want to acquire some of your coins. Join our Patreon and gain access to our full-length bonus episodes, diving even deeper into the world of 15th century Bohemia. Thank you.
To understand this, we have to look at the lives of ordinary people in Bohemia at the time. For years, the country was ravaged by foreign armies and bandits. The breakdown in order meant that the daily reality of the commoners was full of poverty, hunger, sickness, and death.
The people who lived through such desperate times longed for a deeper, more personal connection with God. They saw their misfortune as proof that the end of the world was coming. The church, instead of providing satisfactory answers, gorged itself on riches it didn't deserve. But there was hope. The Hussites offered an alternative, especially those Hussites who weren't afraid to use extreme measures, such as a particular priest preaching in the city of Prague.
His name was Jan Zelivsky, and he came from a humble background. He used to be a member of the White Canons, an order of priests living a communal life similar to that of monks. Their days were mostly filled with prayers in a secluded countryside monastery. However, even the thick walls couldn't keep out the news of the changes brought about by Čeněk and his Hussites. For someone living under a strict set of rules, the idea of change must have been enticing. So when Zelivsky saw his chance, he seized it and defected from his monastery.
He traveled to the capital under the assumption that he could contribute to the ongoing revolution. And he did get a job at one of Prague's many churches. It didn't come with a lot of money, but Zelivsky was excited anyway. He started saving up for books, he read, and he studied, all with the aim of helping build a new, better Catholic Church.
Soon, Zelivsky started communicating with the people at the Prague University, the center of religious discourse in Bohemia. If he wanted to truly leave his mark on the movement, he would have to start there. But there was a problem. The majority of the professors immediately dismissed him as a complete nobody. Why should they care about what he had to say? Where did he get his education again? Oh, that's right, nowhere at all. He was only better than a peasant in that he could read, but that was hardly enough to conduct a proper philosophical debate.
This rejection hurt Zelivsky deeply. He did everything he possibly could. He made a leap into the unknown, and they laughed at him? Wasn't the Hussite movement supposed to bring the church back to the common man? He channeled his anger and frustration into his sermons. And soon, he found out that the professors were wrong about one thing at least. He might not be the most educated man around, but he was excellent at preaching and firing up the crowd.
It came naturally to Zelivsky to choose the right metaphor for the moment, to keep it simple so that his followers understood what he meant, to stoke their emotions and sense of justice. And he had grand ideas of his own. He spoke about a new world in which everyone would have to work for their daily bread. No one would be given something for nothing.
Zelivsky's poor little church soon became an attraction, and it seemed his career was about to finally take off, despite what the arrogant professors might think. But then came a heavy blow. Do you remember the compromise King Wenceslaus pushed through to solve the religious tension gripping his kingdom? The Hussites would from this point on be barred from all Prague churches, except 3 specifically designated for this purpose. Of course, Zelivsky's backwater temple wasn't one of them. So, the talented preacher, thinking he would soon find his fame and fortune, instead suddenly found himself without a job.
It wasn't the end of the world for Zelivsky. His growing popularity was such that he soon found work in one of the approved churches. But it made him think. Could he really trust the higher-ups that they wouldn't pull something like this again? Could an acceptable compromise with the Catholics be ever achieved? Probably not. The only answer was to fight tooth and nail. The Hussites had to fight, and they had to win.
While the poor masses of Prague were slowly getting ready to blow, the situation in the countryside wasn't much calmer. The villages, just like the streets of the capital, were full of impoverished, disillusioned people with deep sympathies towards the Hussite cause. And since they, thanks to King Wenceslaus and his compromise, had no chapels or churches of their own, they would congregate under the open sky, specifically on hills and mountains, as close to the face of God as possible.
These gatherings were simple. The chapel was often nothing fancier than a simple tent. Nevertheless, they quickly gained popularity. The regular church ceremonies could be cold and distant. whereas here, the atmosphere was warm and full of mutual care. The hundreds or even thousands of people meeting upon the hills addressed each other as brothers and sisters. And yet, there was an ever-present sense of foreboding. The communities were all nervously waiting for the impending arrival of the Antichrist.
The center of gravity of the Hussite movement now shifted from the elites to the commoners. The new radical wing was gathering more and more power and influence. At the same time, the moderate Hussites were confused and divided, as evidenced by Czenik of Wartenberg's yielding to Sigismund.
Jan Zelivsky was well aware of the situation in the countryside. He maintained constant communication with the organizers and may have even attended one of the gatherings himself. He liked what he saw, the preaching directed at the common folk, the intensity of their faith, and the strong sense of unity. All of this only strengthened his conviction that there was no turning back. The time for radical change had arrived.
Zelivsky himself was, meanwhile, fanning the flames back in Prague. His sermons were becoming more and more militant. One time, he told the biblical story of Judith, the woman who beheaded an enemy general. This had obvious implications. If you're tormented by the powerful, you're completely within your rights to do them harm and to kill them if necessary.
He also understood the importance of spreading the Hussite message outside of the church. So he organized parades through the city. He was often seen walking at the head of a crowd, carrying the monstrance fixed on a long pole, a holy object usually resembling a golden sun, symbolizing the victory of Christ. It was a sight to behold, which was surely Zelivsky's aim, to show that no matter what Sigismund or the Pope said, the Hussites were here to stay and weren't afraid to show their faces.
Zelivsky was clearly a bold man. But on a warm day in the middle of June, he did something so daring it borders on the unbelievable. That day, King Wenceslaus took a trip to the streets of his capital city. He went to visit the church of St. Apollinaris, an idyllic place on a hill surrounded by gardens and vineyards. But instead of a peaceful morning walk, he was ambushed. A large group of Hussites unexpectedly surrounded him. They weren't armed, but the sheer number of them made the king afraid.
We don't know for sure whether the orders came from Zelivsky, as he wasn't personally present. Most sources agree, however, that he was the mastermind behind the ambush. The Hussites delivered a request to the shocked king. He would once again let them preach in their own churches, and all the persecution of the reformists would stop. The situation was charged and unpredictable, but for once, Wenceslaus managed to stay diplomatic. He politely agreed to look at their plea, and the Hussites let him go. So it all ended peacefully. But once Wenceslaus was safe behind the walls of his castle, he exploded in rage.
How dare they accost the king? How dare they request anything of him in this manner? If they wanted to speak to him, they should have applied for an audience, not trap him in the street. This was an insult, a complete disregard for royal majesty. And who was responsible? Why, the very men Wenceslaus protected and shielded from the anger of his brother. Is this what gratitude looks like? Or is this the worst kind of treachery?
We shouldn't be surprised that Wenceslaus took it all very badly. The king had already been captured 2 times during his reign, and he was obviously very sensitive to any restrictions of his personal freedom. The Hussites should have known this, but either they didn't realize it, or they simply didn't care. In any case, it soon became clear as day that Zelivsky miscalculated.
Wenceslaus acted swiftly. He sent the leader of the group that ambushed him near St. Apollinaris into exile. Some of the followers were imprisoned. He also dismissed the councillors of the new town of Prague, men who were sympathetic to the Hussites. In their place, he installed his own people, more Catholic and also completely loyal to the king. And in a stroke clearly aimed at Zelivsky himself, he banned religious processions through the city. King Wenceslaus, who for so long protected the Hussites, or at least stayed neutral towards them, now became their foe.
Jan Zelivsky was taken aback by this. In the notes he took at the time, he expressed his fears that soon King Wenceslaus would forbid the hilltop sermons as well. In his mind, the situation started to resemble the distant past in which the first Christians were persecuted by the dastardly Romans, and King Wenceslaus played the part of the bloodthirsty emperor.
Zelivsky didn't despair, though. This had happened to him once before, after all. He lost his job and his church because of what the king did. And it only made him stronger and more popular. So in a way, this new setback became a catalyst. Zelivsky decided on trying something big. Something that, as it turns out, would forever change the trajectory of the entire Hussite movement.
The first hints that trouble was brewing came from the king's spies who infiltrated one of the many hilltop gatherings. This particular meeting was one of the largest, reportedly drawing 40,000 attendees from across the kingdom. While everyone at the assembly spoke about love, brotherhood, and true faith in God, there were also more sinister whispers of concrete plans.
Some that reached Wenceslaus's ears were likely just rumors, such as talks of overthrowing the king. However, the spies also gathered information about an event planned on July the 30th. They didn't know what the Hussites' move would be exactly, only that it would be centered on the city hall in the new town of Prague. A city hall recently purged of Hussite councillors and newly staffed by the king's Catholic-leaning loyalists.
It happened on a Sunday. The morning typically reserved for mass and peaceful rest took on a different tone this time. Zelivsky in his church delivered a fiery sermon that stirred the crowd into a frenzy. It might have seemed spontaneous to some, but it was probably planned and prepared well in advance. After all, we know that many of the Hussites arrived fully armed.
Then the crowd marched upon the city hall. Their stated aim was to liberate the Hussites arrested for ambushing the king near St. Apollinaris a few weeks earlier. But the people outside the building weren't interested in negotiations. It's hard to tell what exact impulse led the mob to storm the city hall. Maybe they were ordered to do it by Zelivsky. Maybe he genuinely wanted to talk but couldn't keep the furious crowd under control. Either way, the wooden doors didn't represent much of an obstacle, nor did the dozen men inside, who were about to be brutally murdered.
Only 4 of them were actually the king's councillors, by the way. But the Hussites butchered everyone without mercy. They killed a friend of one of the councillors. They killed several craftsmen. They didn't even spare the servants. Anyone inside at the time of the assault was thrown out of the window and hacked to pieces by the armed mob in the street.
From a certain point of view, the first defenestration of Prague was a stunning victory for the radical Hussites. They got rid of some of their powerful enemies and faced no immediate repercussions. But for Zelivsky, it represented the crossing of the Rubicon. He, a consecrated cleric, turned away from his oath and led the people on the path of open violence. Not only that, he directly challenged the power of the king. Before this incident, there was still a chance the simmering situation could be resolved peacefully. That chance evaporated as soon as the first councillor hit the pavement outside the city hall.
It was the start of a holy war where the usual lines between murder and justified killing disappeared. And it gave Zelivsky a new nickname, the Bloody Priest.
The aftermath of the massacre shows even more evidence that the whole thing was carefully planned. There was no looting or other kinds of spontaneous violence one would expect. The mob didn't even rob the bodies of the people they murdered. Instead, the Hussites immediately elected 4 temporary officials to govern the new town until new councillors could be elected. This wasn't just an angry outburst. It was an attempt at a coup.
Its success would depend on the reaction of the king. By now, many of you can probably guess the first thing Wenceslaus did when he learned the news. He got apocalyptically angry. Then he calmed down, got depressed, wallowed in self-pity, and finally agreed to everything the Hussites wanted. Zelivsky got a pretty reward for the defenestration. A city council elected not by the king, but by the people.
This was obviously unprecedented, a stunning breach of the law and the king's authority. But Wenceslaus simply didn't have the strength to fight anymore. From every corner of the kingdom, word reached him that radical Hussites, inspired by the defenestration, attacked and looted Catholic monasteries. The people he had tried so hard to protect betrayed him.
A week after the defenestration, Wenceslaus started complaining of a pain in his left arm. He looked tired, his spirit completely broken. After a couple of days, it seemed like he was getting better, but the opposite was true. In the afternoon, he experienced a devastating seizure, probably a heart attack. On the 16th of July, 1419, at the age of 58, King Wenceslaus of Bohemia died.
The news of the king's death spread throughout the country like wildfire. But instead of solemn respect for a king who rules the country for 40 long years, the mood was elated. It turned out that by now, everyone despised Wenceslaus. The Germans hated him because he couldn't be bothered to actually rule the Holy Roman Empire. The Bohemian Catholics hated him because he used to protect the Hussites. And the Hussites hated him because in trying to find a compromise, he became a useful substitute for the Antichrist. For basically everyone, his death was a welcome sign that marked the end of an unhappy era and the beginning of a new, hopeful one.
There was to be no grand funeral for the chosen heir of the great Emperor Charles, no procession through the streets of the capital. Wenceslaus was quietly buried in a simple ceremony within a monastery's grounds. Only the monks, bakers, and fishermen were there to bid him farewell.
Even after all this, the king was still not granted a peaceful rest. Less than a year later, a band of armed Hussites sacked the monastery. According to chronicles, they exhumed Wenceslaus's body, doused it with wine, and mockingly covered it in hay. They ended their rampage by setting the entire place ablaze. It was a local fisherman who recovered the king's remains and secretly interred them, awaiting calmer times.
4 years passed before Wenceslaus was finally moved to St. Vitus Cathedral, the burial site of his father. This also happened to be the resting place Wenceslaus specifically wished to avoid, He never forgot his bitter dispute with Jan of Jenstein 3 decades ago that escalated into the death of an innocent man. The cathedral, whose construction Jenstein supervised, served as a painful reminder of that conflict. Unfortunately for Wenceslaus, who had many unfulfilled wishes throughout his life, even his final one wasn't granted.
No one can be sure what exactly went through the head of King Sigismund. Was he mourning his brother? Was he indifferent to the loss of someone who had long ago lost his respect? Was he happy that the last obstacle on his way to the crown of Bohemia disappeared? In any case, Wenceslaus's death must have come as a surprise to Sigismund, or it at least came with the worst timing imaginable. Why? Well, Sigismund was completely unprepared for what was to follow.
He couldn't immediately move to seize power in Bohemia because he was in Hungary at that time, on a military campaign against the Turks. So he delegated the rule of the Kingdom of Bohemia to our 2 old acquaintances, Sophia of Bavaria, the Queen Widow, and Czeniec of Württemberg, the Supreme Burgrave of Bohemia.
This clearly wasn't the perfect setup for Sigismund. Queen Sophia was sympathetic to the Hussites, as was Czeniec. He may have distanced himself from the conflict with Sigismund and the Pope, but he was still much closer to the Hussites than the Catholics. But the King of Hungary didn't really have a choice. He needed someone the Bohemian nobility would accept for the regency, someone who could maintain the peace until Sigismund returned to claim his throne.
Unfortunately, peace was in short supply in Central Europe, and some people were getting more ambitious by the day. It soon showed. After Wenceslaus's death, according to legal customs of the day, the Bohemian nobility could now negotiate with the new king for concessions. Think of it as a new contract after a change in management. And the Czech nobles quickly realized they might have a strong hand to play. They could afford to demand quite a lot from the absent, busy king.
Their demands were quite something. If Sigismund read them during dinner, he probably choked on his chicken. The moderate Hussites had a big say among the nobility, and it showed. The king was told that the Kingdom of Bohemia would allow the Hussite rights, including the communion under both kinds. The priests would be forbidden to own property. The church services would be conducted in Czech language, and every decree and decision sent by the Pope would have to be approved by the king.
It wasn't all about religion either. The national aspect also played a role. The demands of the nobility clearly sought to improve the circumstances of the Czech population and put down the many Germans living in the kingdom. Only Czechs would be allowed to serve in the bureaucracy, for example. The same was true for the leadership of the cities. All trials would be conducted in Czech, and no foreign judge would be allowed to pass judgment on Czech citizens.
Sigismund wasn't thrilled by this at all. He was at the borders of Christian Europe, risking his life fighting against the terrible Ottoman Empire, protecting them all from the ever-approaching rise of Islam, the danger he warned everyone about all his life. And the ungrateful fools tried to pull something like this? No, this would not stand. Sigismund would deal with the Turks as best he could, and then he would deal with Bohemia.
He would have to be patient, however. He sent the nobles a letter in which he permitted the communion under both kinds, at least until he returned to the country. Then there would be a new discussion and possibly a new decision. In short, Sigismund was buying himself some time, even if he knew that this Hussite nonsense was something that he would never allow in the long term.
If Sigismund wasn't interested in a compromise, There was another faction which felt the same way. The radical elements of the Hussites, the poor and the downtrodden, mainly concentrated in the countryside. The moderate Hussite nobility wanted the reformers and the Catholics in Bohemia to live side by side, the so-called Kingdom of Two Peoples. The radicals wanted the Catholics gone. The church was too corrupt, too far gone, and it was quite possible that the Pope was the Antichrist. A completely new beginning was needed.
If this meant defying the nobles, so be it. What were they good for anyway? They didn't care about the troubles of the poor. They never experienced starvation or homelessness. Their families weren't dying out in plague epidemics. And haven't the radicals already proven they were strong? The defenestration worked like a charm. Why couldn't they go a few steps further?
So the radicals went to Prague, the capital and the center of power. And at first, it looked like a peaceful visit. The more moderate Hussites in Prague welcomed their countryside brothers and sisters with open arms. They talked about God and the new world that was coming. They drank, ate, and celebrated.
But soon the atmosphere changed. The radicals started to call the shots in the city. They stopped celebrating and started attacking churches instead. The radical wing of the Hussites didn't like unnecessary luxuries such as paintings and golden ornaments, so they were looted or thrown away.
The division became steadily worse over the next month. Parties and friendly debates were replaced by rows, arguments, and fisticuffs. Then it all culminated in a literal conflagration. In one district of Prague, the escalating violence prompted the Supreme Burgrave Čeněk to send in his troops. But instead of restoring peace, what followed was days of bloody street fighting between the soldiers and the radicals. In the end, a large part of the city was left in smoking ruins.
The moderate Hussites in Prague were stunned by this development. They welcomed the radicals as siblings in Christ, and now they were burning down their homes? Why were they even fighting against Lord Čeněk? He was a Hussite after all, and even if he now ruled thanks to an agreement with the hated Sigismund, he was the one who tried to protect Master Jan Hus all those years ago.
What was worse, the radicals were actually winning. They could hold their own against Čeněk's men and even managed to take the Vyšehrad castle, an important strategic position. Queen Sofia, concerned about her safety, fled the city. Čeněk, with his back against the wall, called up German mercenaries to defend Prague Castle. In short, it seemed the radicals were poised to take over Prague, and with it, perhaps the whole kingdom.
Fairly or unfairly, thanks to the successes of the radicals, the capital was now seen as a hotbed of zealotry by those outside the city. Soon, more than 100 noblemen declared themselves enemies of Prague. 4 major cities followed. What began as a brotherly celebration now threatened to become a full-fledged civil war.
But now, it was the radicals' turn to be surprised. They may have successfully stood against Čeněk and his men, but they couldn't stay in the city for long if they lost the support of the population. And that is exactly what happened. The more moderate Hussite elements, which were dominant among the people of Prague, reacted to the brewing chaos by going behind the radicals' back. They signed a separate peace treaty with Čeněk and the Queen. The radicals suddenly found themselves without allies they counted on. So, instead of storming Prague Castle, they sounded the retreat back to the countryside.
This was a humiliating setback for the radical Hussites.
They had the city in the palms of their hands. There was even talk about electing a new king for themselves. In an instant, it was all gone. The mentality of the people in the capital and in the countryside was simply too far removed, as were their goals. The radical Hussites had thought Prague was their Jerusalem, the chosen city of God. As they left its gates behind, they found it to be the cursed Babylon.
Some of them dispersed back to the countryside. Others left for the other major city in the vicinity, Pilsen, where they hoped to find more welcome. But the bitterness they felt wouldn't disappear overnight. The radicals were more than ready to continue the fight and avenge themselves on those who had wronged them. Among them, a particular man, a seasoned military commander, a man with only one eye, a man who would become legendary as one of the best generals who ever lived. Both the Catholics and the treacherous moderates would soon pay. Jan Hus was ready to claim his place in the history books.
A big thank you to everyone who's helping make this podcast happen, especially to Bohumil Červený and Martin Baláš, our Jan Žižka's own patrons. Thanks so much, guys.